Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Ashes. A short story by Benjamin Dawn. Chapter 1. The Fire That Should Not Have Burned. Inspector Lestrade sent for us on a morning that still carried the smell of smoke. London had seen no shortage of fires. Carelessness, faulty lamps, the usual accompaniments of a growing city. But this one had troubled him in a way he could not clearly express. His message was brief, almost reluctant, as if he himself doubted the legitimacy of his concern. A small matter, Watson. No fatalities, no theft. Yet something is amiss. The building stood near the river, a modest warehouse that had once stored paper goods, and, more recently, nothing of particular note. The fire had been contained quickly. The damage, according to the fire brigade, was unremarkable. Inside, the air was stale and acrid. Charred beams lay collapsed like exhausted limbs. Ash covered the floor in soft, uneven drifts. Everything spoke of chance and carelessness. Everything, except one thing. On a scorched wooden table near the rear wall lay a single book. It was untouched. No scorch marks marred its cover. No smoke stains dulled its pages. It lay precisely where it must have rested before the fire, surrounded by blackened debris, as though the flames had passed around it with deliberate restraint. Lestrade noticed my pause. "Odd, isn't it?" he said. "The fire started not 3 feet from there." I bent closer and read the title embossed upon the spine. Meditations, Marcus Aurelius. A philosophical sort of warehouse, I remarked lightly. Lestrade did not smile. "This is the 3rd fire this month," he said quietly. "Different locations, different causes, if you believe the reports. But every time," he hesitated, then gestured toward the book, "there's something like that." I did not yet understand the weight of his words, but I knew enough to recognize the reason for our summons. Somewhere in London, amid smoke and cinders, a man was making choices. And choices, I had learned, were the language of intention. Chapter 2. Patterns in the Soot. Holmes arrived late. That in itself was unusual enough to merit notice. When at last his tall figure appeared in the doorway of the warehouse, he paused there for several seconds, his eyes half closed, as though listening to something inaudible to the rest of us. "Good morning, Lestrade," he said at last. "You have brought me to see a fire that did not behave like a fire." Lestrade stiffened. "That's exactly what I couldn't put into words." Holmes did not reply. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to disturb the ash beneath his feet. His gaze passed over the collapsed beams, the blackened walls, the scorched floorboards, each given equal attention. None granted importance. Then he stopped. The book lay where I had left it. Holmes crouched, his long fingers hovering just above the cover, never quite touching it. "Marcus Aurelius," he murmured. "An emperor who believed the universe to be governed by reason." He straightened abruptly. "Where were the others, Lestrade?" "The others?" "The other books," Holmes said patiently. "There must have been more." Lestrade gestured vaguely toward the far end of the room. "Burned to nothing, as far as we can tell." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed a private suspicion. "May I see the reports from the previous fires?" Lestrade produced them at once. Holmes skimmed the pages with extraordinary speed, his eyes darting not across sentences, but between them. "Different locations," he said. "Different accelerants. Different times of day. Excellent work, whoever planned this." "You mean the fires?" Lestrade asked sharply. "I mean the man," Holmes replied. "Fires do not plan." He moved to the window, examining the soot-streaked glass. "In the first case," he continued, "you preserved a copy of On the Origin of Species. In the second, The Wealth of Nations. And here, Marcus Aurelius." He turned back to us. "These are not trophies. They are not messages to the police. They are a sequence." "A sequence of what?" I asked. Holmes' lips curved into the faintest smile. "Of a mind," he said, "and a very particular one." Chapter 3. What the Fire Spares. Holmes insisted that we revisit the earlier sites that same afternoon. "Memory," he remarked as we rode through the streets, "is a notoriously unreliable witness. Fortunately, ash is not." The first building stood in Clerkenwell, a former printer's workshop. The fire had gutted most of the interior, yet the walls still bore the ghostly outlines of shelving long since collapsed. Holmes moved through the space with measured steps, his attention fixed not on the damage, but on the margins of it. "Here," he said, stopping before a scorched alcove. "You see the mark?" I followed his gaze. A darker rectangle stood out faintly against the blackened wall. "A bookcase," I ventured. "Indeed. And here." He moved a few paces to the left. "Another." He consulted his notes. "The surviving book was found here," he said, indicating the first alcove. "Correct?" "Yes," I replied. "On the Origin of Species," Holmes nodded. "The second fire," he continued, "occurred in a counting house near Holborn. There the pattern repeated itself. Burned ledgers, charred desks, and once again, a single space where something had been removed before the flames were allowed to do their work." "This is not preservation," Holmes said quietly. "It is selection." By the time we reached the third site, the warehouse by the river, the conclusion was inescapable. "These books," I said slowly, "they weren't spared by chance." Holmes looked at me with approval. "No. They were chosen before the fire began. "But why leave them behind at all?" I asked. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Because destruction alone proves nothing. But controlled destruction, that reveals intention." He drew the 3 titles together on a scrap of paper. "On the Origin of Species, The Wealth of Nations, Meditations." "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what do these books have in common?" "They are influential?" "Yes, but influence alone would give us 1,000 possibilities." He tapped the list with his finger. "They are milestones. Each proposes an order underlying apparent chaos. Nature, society, the self." He folded the paper. "Our man is not an anarchist. He is a believer." Chapter 4. The man who leaves remains. Holmes did not return to Baker Street that evening. Instead, he spent the night compiling lists, names, professions, dates, until our sitting room resembled the aftermath of a bureaucratic explosion. Ledgers lay open beside police reports. Library catalogues were stacked with the precision of a military formation. By morning, the fog had lifted from the streets, but not from Holmes's mind. "Our man," he said at last, "does not break into buildings." Lestrade, who had joined us reluctantly, frowned. "Every site was secured." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "Yet each was accessed without force. Doors unlocked, no windows broken, no witnesses startled." He tapped a column of names. "Caretakers, clerks, night watchmen, librarians, inspectors." "Inspectors?" Lestrade echoed. "Fire inspectors," Holmes clarified. "Men who walk freely through buildings after hours, whose presence invites no suspicion." I felt a chill then, not from the morning air. "You think he studies the buildings before choosing them?" I said. "No," Holmes answered. "He studies the shelves." He rose and paced. Each location contained a modest collection of books. Nothing remarkable, nothing catalogued with care. Our man enters under the guise of duty, observes, and chooses. "Chooses what?" Lestrade asked. Holmes stopped. "The book that speaks to him," he said simply. He picked up a slim volume from the table. "A man who selects Marcus Aurelius, Adam Smith, and Charles Darwin does not do so lightly. These are not fashionable ornaments. They are companions." "Companions?" I repeated. "Yes, books one returns to," Holmes said softly. "Books that reassure a mind that doubts." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "So who is he?" Holmes looked at us both. "A man of method. A man accustomed to classification. A man who believes the world is orderly, provided one removes the excess and the fires." "A proof," Holmes replied. "An experiment conducted in public, yet understood only by those who know how to read." Chapter 5. An Order of Destruction. Holmes stood before the fire, unlit. It was an old habit of his to pause at the edge of a thought, as though allowing it one final chance to escape. Then, with a decisive motion, he struck the match and drew deeply. "The sequence is incomplete," he said. Lestrade looked up sharply. "Incomplete?" "Yes. 3 books do not form a system. They form a progression." He moved to the table and rearranged the titles upon a sheet of paper. "Nature, society, the self. Darwin explains the world as it is," Holmes continued. "Smith explains how men behave within it. Marcus Aurelius, how one ought to endure it." He tapped the empty space beneath the list. "But something is missing." "What?" I asked. Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. "The act," he said. "The principle that allows a man to intervene." He crossed the room and began consulting the fire reports once more. Not the summaries, but the margins. Notes written hastily, addresses circled, then struck through. At each site, he said, there was evidence of a 4th book, mentioned by witnesses, listed in inventories, yet never recovered. Lestrade leaned forward. "You're saying it was taken?" "Removed," Holmes corrected. "Before the fire." He turned to us. "The missing title is always the same." He wrote it down with deliberate care. "Novum Organum, Francis Bacon." Lestrade drew in a sharp breath. "Method," he murmured. "Precisely," Holmes said. "The philosophy of control, of experiment, of reshaping nature through reason." He smiled thinly. "Our man is not burning books. He is curating them." "And the next fire?" I asked. Holmes' gaze shifted toward the window, where the city lay sprawled in the pale afternoon light. "There will be none," he said. "He has already finished." Chapter 6. The Fire That Was Never Lit. Holmes led us not to a warehouse, nor to a counting house, nor to any place that bore the scars of flame. He led us to a library. It was a modest institution, tucked away behind a narrow square in Bloomsbury, frequented chiefly by clerks and scholars of limited means. Its shelves were orderly, its catalogue meticulously kept, its reading room quiet to the point of reverence. "This," Holmes said softly, "is where our man belongs." Lestrade frowned. "There's been no fire here." "Exactly." We were received by the senior librarian, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the distracted air of one perpetually engaged in classification. He greeted Holmes with professional courtesy, unaware that he was already the subject of a complete and damning analysis. "You oversee acquisitions as well as inspections, do you not?" Holmes asked conversationally. "Yes," the man replied. "I also liaise with the fire office regarding safety compliance." "Of course you do." Holmes strolled along the shelves, trailing his fingers just above the spines. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I observe that your collection is unusually curated." The librarian smiled faintly. "One does what one can with limited space." Holmes stopped. One shelf was incomplete. A small gap, barely noticeable, yet unmistakable to an eye trained in absence rather than presence. "Novum organum," Holmes said. "Removed recently." The librarian stiffened. "I regret to say it was damaged." "By smoke?" Holmes asked gently. "No." "By fire?" "No." Holmes turned. "You took it with you," he said, "just as you took it from the other sites. You needed it intact, not as a symbol, but as a tool." The man's composure failed him then. "I never intended harm," he said quickly. "The buildings were insured, the fires controlled." "Controlled," Holmes echoed. "Yes, that is precisely the word." He gestured to the shelves. "You sought to demonstrate that order may be imposed upon chaos, that even destruction may be shaped by method. The books you spared comforted you. The one you removed justified you." Silence fell over the room. "There was to be a final fire," Holmes continued. "Not here, but it would have completed the sequence. Nature, society, the self, and finally, action." He met the man's eyes. "You stopped because you were satisfied." Lestrade stepped forward. "And because," Holmes added quietly, "you knew I would be." Epilogue. What cannot be burned. The matter never reached the newspapers. Lestrade ensured that it did not. The fires were quietly attributed to negligence, the accused man described as unbalanced but harmless. London, content with such explanations, returned to its business. Only Holmes seemed untouched by the relief that followed. One evening, as the autumn fog crept once more along Baker Street, I found him seated by the window, a book resting unopened upon his knee. "Do you regret it?" I asked. He did not look up. "No," he said. "I regret only that he was correct about one thing. And that is, that destruction reveals truth more readily than creation," Holmes replied. "Fire strips away pretense. It leaves only what matters." He closed the book at last. "But it is a crude instrument." I glanced at the volume in his hand. It was Meditations. "You kept it," I said. "Yes," Holmes answered, "as a reminder." "Of what?" "That reason without humility becomes tyranny," he said softly, "and that even the most orderly mind may convince itself that it acts for the greater good." Outside, a chimney sent a thin plume of smoke into the night air. It dispersed quickly, lost among 1,000 others. London slept, and somewhere in its countless rooms, books remained upon their shelves, waiting to be read, not burned. This was Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Ashes. A short story by Benjamin Dawn. If you liked this, please subscribe and listen to other stories about your favorite consulting detective.